Behind the explosive action and Stallone's iconic performance in First Blood lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets that would make even Rambo do a double take. From stolen military weapons worth $50,000 to a Hollywood legend who demanded the strangest alternate ending ever conceived, this action masterpiece hides some truly jaw-dropping stories. Did you know the film's most treasured prop was actual garbage? Or that a future CSI superstar got his big break as a young deputy? Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Rambo. First Blood, 1982. Fact 1. The Rambo name came from an apple. When author David Morrell sat down to write his 1972 novel First Blood, he faced a problem that every writer knows all too well. The story of a troubled Vietnam War veteran clashing with small-town authorities was taking shape in his mind, but the protagonist remained nameless. Morrell struggled with this creative block for days, trying out different names that just didn't feel right for the intense, battle-hardened soldier he was creating. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected way possible. During a simple afternoon snack, Morrell was taking a break from writing when his wife offered him an apple. He bit into the crisp, sweet fruit and was immediately impressed by its flavor. Curious about what he was eating, Morrell asked his wife what type of apple it was. Her answer would change action movie history forever. "Rambo," she replied. The moment Morrell heard that word, something clicked. As he later explained, he instantly recognized what he called the sound of force in the name. The word had a powerful, almost explosive quality that seemed perfect for his military protagonist. But there was another layer to his inspiration that made the choice even more meaningful. The name reminded Morrell of how some people pronounced Rimbaud, referring to the famous French poet Arthur Rimbaud, whose most celebrated work was titled A Season in Hell. This literary connection struck Morrell as remarkably fitting, since he felt that A Season in Hell served as an apt metaphor for the prisoner of war experiences he imagined his character Rambo suffering through during the Vietnam War. The apple that inspired the name was actually a variety cultivated by a 17th-century Swedish settler named Peter Gunnarsson Rambo, though Morrell didn't learn this historical detail until much later. In his original novel, Morrell never gave the character a first name, simply calling him Rambo throughout the story. It wasn't until Sylvester Stallone adapted the book for the screen that the character gained his full identity as John Rambo, but the surname that would become synonymous with action movies around the world came from that single, perfectly timed bite of an apple. Fact 2. Rambo's coat was real garbage. In one of the most memorable scenes from First Blood, a desperate and freezing John Rambo discovers a large piece of weathered canvas in the forest and cleverly cuts it into a makeshift coat to protect himself from the harsh elements. What viewers don't realize while watching this iconic moment is that the tattered material Sylvester Stallone wraps around himself wasn't created by the movie's prop department at all, but was actually a genuine piece of rotting canvas that the film crew stumbled upon during production in the Canadian wilderness. The discovery happened completely by accident while the crew was scouting and preparing locations for filming in the forests around Hope, British Columbia. Someone on the production team spotted this old, deteriorated piece of canvas lying abandoned in the woods, probably left behind by campers or workers years earlier. Instead of dismissing it as trash, the crew recognized that this authentic piece of weathered material would work perfectly for the survival scenes they needed to shoot. What made this find even more valuable was the fact that there was only one piece of this particular canvas available, which meant the production couldn't afford to lose or damage it during filming. Stallone himself joked about how this random piece of garbage became one of the most treasured and carefully protected props on the entire set, with crew members keeping a close eye on it between takes to make sure nothing happened to their one-of-a-kind find. The canvas served its purpose beautifully in the film, giving Rambo's improvised coat an authentic look of wear and decay that no prop department could have easily replicated. The weathered texture and natural deterioration helped sell the idea that this was truly something a desperate person might find and use for survival in the wilderness. After filming wrapped up and the production moved on, Stallone decided to keep this unique piece of movie history for himself. More than 40 years later, the actor still has that same piece of rotten canvas in his personal collection, serving as a reminder of one of the most resourceful prop discoveries in movie history and proof that sometimes the best movie magic comes from the most unexpected places. Fact 3. $50,000 worth of weapons vanished. One of the most shocking incidents during the production of First Blood had nothing to do with the dramatic action scenes being filmed, but rather with a real-life crime that turned the movie set into the center of a major theft investigation. In January 1982, while the crew was working on location in British Columbia, Canada, thieves made off with an enormous arsenal of weapons worth over $50,000 that had been imported specifically for the film. The stolen weaponry read like an inventory from a military armory, including 14 M16 rifles, 3 Remington shotguns, 2 .44 Magnum revolvers, and 11 Colt AR-15 rifles. All of these firearms had to be specially imported into Canada because of the country's strict gun regulations, making them both expensive and difficult to replace. The production had gone through considerable red tape and paperwork to get these weapons legally brought across the border for filming purposes. What made this theft particularly concerning to law enforcement was that while these guns had been modified to fire only blank ammunition for movie use, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police warned that they could be relatively easily converted back to fire live rounds. This meant that a significant number of potentially dangerous weapons were now in the hands of unknown criminals, creating a serious public safety concern that extended far beyond the movie production. The incident forced the production team to completely rethink their security measures for the remainder of filming. Unable to take any more chances with expensive and potentially dangerous equipment, the producers made the unusual decision to bring in the Canadian Army to provide security for the set. This meant that real soldiers were stationed around the filming locations to guard against any future thefts. In an interesting twist, these same Canadian Army soldiers who were brought in to protect the production also ended up serving as extras in the film itself, appearing in various scenes as additional military personnel. The theft incident created a unique situation where the people protecting the movie also became part of the movie, though viewers watching First Blood would have no idea about the dramatic real-life security crisis that led to their presence on screen. Fact 4. Stallone accidentally broke actor's nose for real. During the filming of one of First Blood's most intense sequences, Sylvester Stallone ended up causing real injury to a fellow actor in a moment that perfectly demonstrates how physical and unpredictable movie fight scenes can be. The incident occurred while shooting the dramatic jail escape scene, where Rambo breaks free from the police station after being tormented and abused by the deputies who had arrested him. In this pivotal scene, Stallone's character fights his way out of custody using a combination of slide kicks and elbow strikes against the officers trying to restrain him. During one particular take, Stallone was supposed to elbow actor Alf Humphreys, who played the deputy named Lester, in what should have been a carefully choreographed move. However, something went wrong with the timing or positioning, and instead of the controlled stage combat that was planned, Stallone's elbow connected with Humphrey's face with full force. The impact was powerful enough to break Humphrey's nose, and the genuine screams of pain that viewers hear in the final film are actually the actor's real reaction to being injured. Rather than stopping production to reshoot the scene with a stunt double or different camera angle, the filmmakers decided to keep this authentic moment of pain and injury in the movie, making it one of the most realistic-sounding moments of violence in the entire film. If you watch First Blood carefully after this scene, you'll notice that Humphrey's character Lester wears a band-aid across his nose for the remainder of his screen time. This wasn't a character choice or part of the original script, but rather a practical necessity to cover the real injury that Stallone had accidentally inflicted during filming. What makes this incident even more remarkable is the strange coincidence it created with the source material. In David Morrell's original novel that the movie was based on, there's a scene where Rambo breaks a police officer's nose by elbowing him in the face during this exact same jail escape sequence. Stallone's accidental injury to Humphreys meant that life ended up imitating art in the most unexpected and painful way possible. Fact 5. Kirk Douglas wanted bizarrely dark ending. Hollywood legend Kirk Douglas was originally cast to play Colonel Sam Trotman, Rambo's former commanding officer and mentor, but his vision for how the movie should end was so strange and dark that it ultimately led to his departure from the project. Douglas had his own ideas about where the story should go, and his proposed alternate ending was unlike anything that mainstream audiences would have expected from an action movie. According to Stallone's recollection of Douglas's pitch, the legendary actor wanted First Blood to conclude with Trotman actually killing Rambo, similar to how the character dies in David Morrell's original novel. But Douglas didn't want to stop there with a simple death scene. His version would have featured a final shot that was both haunting and deeply unsettling, showing a police car driving away into the fog after Rambo's death. The truly bizarre part of Douglas's ending concept came in what would happen next in this final shot. As Stallone later described it, the camera would focus on the rear-view mirror of the departing police car, where a hand would slowly reach up into view. The camera would then tilt upward to reveal Douglas's face, but with a shocking twist that would have completely changed the meaning of the entire film. In the mirror, audiences would see that Trotman was now wearing Rambo's iconic red headband. This strange image was meant to suggest that by killing his former student, Trotman had somehow become possessed by Rambo's spirit, or had absorbed his violent, rebellious nature. The implication was that the cycle of violence and trauma would continue, with the mentor now transformed into the same kind of dangerous, unstable figure that Rambo had become. Douglas apparently saw this as a more artistic and meaningful conclusion than allowing Rambo to survive. The producers and Stallone found this ending far too dark and confusing for the action movie they were trying to make. When Douglas refused to abandon his vision and continued pushing for script changes that would accommodate his bizarre finale, the production ultimately gave him an ultimatum to stick with the original script or leave the project. Douglas chose to leave, and Richard Crenna was quickly brought in to replace him as Colonel Trotman. Fact 6. The first cut was a 3.5-hour disaster. When the First Blood editing team assembled their initial rough cut of the film, they created what might be one of the most bloated and unwatchable versions of an action movie ever put together. This first attempt at editing all the footage into a coherent story resulted in a version that ran between 3 and 3.5 hours long, turning what should have been a tight, suspenseful thriller into an endless marathon that nobody wanted to sit through. The reaction to this initial cut was so overwhelmingly negative that it became legendary among the cast and crew for all the wrong reasons. When Sylvester Stallone and his agent sat down to watch this first version, the experience was so painful and disappointing that Stallone later said it actually made him physically sick. The pacing was completely off, scenes dragged on far too long, and the overall structure of the movie had been lost in a sea of unnecessary footage that should have been trimmed away. Stallone's reaction to seeing this disaster was so extreme that he seriously considered taking drastic action to prevent it from ever being seen by the public. According to the actor himself, he was so horrified by what he witnessed that he wanted to buy the entire movie from the studio just so he could destroy it completely. In Stallone's mind, this version of First Blood was such a career-killing embarrassment that it would be better for the film to never exist at all rather than be released in this form. The 3.5-hour cut represented everything that could go wrong in the editing process, with scenes that went nowhere, pacing that killed all tension and excitement, and a structure that made the simple story of a veteran's conflict with small-town law enforcement feel like an epic saga that never seemed to end. Stallone genuinely believed that releasing this version would destroy his career and reputation as an actor. Fortunately, the editing team went back to work and completely reconstructed the film through heavy re-editing and cutting. The final theatrical version that audiences saw was trimmed down to a much more manageable 93 minutes, transforming the unwatchable disaster into the tight, effective action thriller that became a classic of the genre. Fact 7. Young David Caruso got his big break. Among the cast of First Blood was a young, relatively unknown actor in his early 20s named David Caruso, who played Deputy Mitch Rogers, one of the local law enforcement officers who gets caught up in the manhunt for Rambo. At the time of filming in 1982, Caruso was just another aspiring actor looking for his breakthrough role in Hollywood, with only a few small parts in movies and television shows under his belt. In First Blood, Caruso's character Mitch is portrayed as one of the more sympathetic deputies working under Sheriff Teasel. Unlike some of the other officers who seem to enjoy tormenting Rambo during his arrest, Mitch shows signs of discomfort with the brutal treatment being inflicted on the Vietnam veteran. He's the deputy who warns Rambo about Sergeant Galt's reputation for violence, and he speaks out against some of the more extreme actions his fellow officers want to take. During the forest chase sequences, Caruso's character becomes one of Rambo's victims when the skilled Green Beret jumps out from camouflage and stabs Mitch in the upper thigh with a knife. This injury effectively takes him out of the hunt, but the character survives the encounter, unlike some of his fellow law enforcement officers. Caruso's performance in these scenes helped establish him as a capable actor who could handle both dramatic moments and action sequences. What makes Caruso's appearance in First Blood particularly interesting is how his career would unfold over the following decades. After spending the 1980s and early 1990s taking various supporting roles in films and television, Caruso would eventually become a household name thanks to his starring role as Detective John Kelly in the groundbreaking police drama NYPD Blue in 1993. However, it was his later role as Lieutenant Horatio Kane in CSI Miami that would make him a true television superstar. Starting in 2002, Caruso became famous for his dramatic one-liners, his signature sunglasses, and his intense delivery style that made him one of the most recognizable faces on television. The young deputy from First Blood had transformed into one of the biggest stars of the CSI franchise, proving that sometimes small roles in classic movies can be the stepping stones to much bigger things. Fact 8. China box office record lasted 33 years. 3 years after its original American release, First Blood achieved something that no other Hollywood movie had ever accomplished before, becoming the first major American blockbuster to be released in mainland China when it hit Chinese theaters in 1985. This groundbreaking release opened up an entirely new market for Western films and created a box office phenomenon that would set records lasting for more than 3 decades. The response from Chinese audiences was absolutely extraordinary, with millions of moviegoers lining up at theaters across the country to see Sylvester Stallone's action-packed story of a troubled Vietnam veteran. The film sold an incredible 76 million tickets during its Chinese theatrical run, a number that was almost impossible to comprehend at the time. To put this in perspective, China had a much smaller entertainment industry in the 1980s, with fewer theaters and limited options for international films, making this level of attendance truly remarkable. What made this achievement even more impressive was how long the record would stand. First Blood's 76 million ticket sales in China remained the highest number ever achieved by an American film in that market for 33 years, lasting all the way until 2018. During those 3 decades, countless Hollywood blockbusters were released in China. As the country's economy grew and its entertainment market expanded dramatically, but none of them could surpass the ticket sales record that Rambo had established. The film's success in China was particularly interesting because of how Chinese audiences interpreted the story. Many viewers saw Rambo as a sympathetic figure who was being oppressed by corrupt authorities, a theme that resonated strongly with Chinese moviegoers. The fact that Rambo was a soldier who had served his country faithfully but was then mistreated by the system struck a chord with audiences who understood the concept of loyal service being poorly rewarded. Chinese theaters showed the film dubbed into Mandarin, and tickets were incredibly affordable at just 60 yuan each, which was roughly 21 cents in American currency. Despite these low ticket prices, the massive number of people who went to see the movie made First Blood a cultural phenomenon that introduced an entire generation of Chinese viewers to American action cinema. Fact 9. the suicide scene was actually filmed. Director Ted Kotcheff and his crew actually shot a completely different ending for First Blood that would have dramatically changed the entire meaning of the movie and prevented any sequels from ever being made. This alternate conclusion featured Rambo committing suicide, staying true to the tragic ending found in David Morrell's original novel, where the troubled veteran sees death as his only escape from the trauma and pain that has consumed his life. The suicide scene was filmed with Stallone and Richard Crenna, showing Colonel Trotman being forced to watch as his former student and surrogate son takes his own life. This version followed the book's darker vision more closely, presenting Rambo as a character who had reached what Stallone described as the point of no return, where the psychological damage from his war experiences and the recent persecution by local authorities had pushed him beyond any possibility of healing or redemption. Kotcheff, who had originally conceived of First Blood as Rambo's suicide mission, believed this ending would create a more powerful artistic statement about the tragic fate of many Vietnam veterans who struggled to readjust to civilian life. The director had spoken with real veterans during his research for the film and had met men who later took their own lives, making him feel that this conclusion would honor their experiences and highlight the serious issues facing returning soldiers. However, when test audiences viewed this version of the film, their reaction was overwhelmingly negative. Viewers found the suicide ending far too depressing and felt it sent the wrong message to Vietnam veterans who might be watching the movie. The feedback suggested that audiences wanted to see Rambo survive and find some hope for recovery, rather than depicting suicide as the inevitable outcome for traumatized veterans. Based on these test screenings, Kotcheff and Stallone decided to reshoot the ending, creating the version where Trotman convinces Rambo to surrender peacefully instead of taking his own life. The original suicide footage was preserved, and decades later, a brief snippet of this discarded ending was actually used as a flashback sequence in the fourth Rambo movie, giving fans a glimpse of what might have been the franchise's very different and much darker conclusion. Fact 10. Rambo kills only one person by accident. One of the most surprising things about First Blood is how restrained John Rambo actually is when it comes to killing his pursuers, especially considering the character's later reputation as a one-man army who mows down countless enemies in the sequels. Despite being hunted by dozens of police officers, sheriff's deputies, and National Guard soldiers throughout the movie, Rambo manages to disable, wound, or incapacitate his opponents without actually killing any of them on purpose. This restraint was a deliberate choice made by Sylvester Stallone when he rewrote the script to make Rambo a more sympathetic character than he was in David Morrell's original novel. In the book, Rambo goes on a violent killing spree and murders more than a dozen people during his conflict with the authorities. But Stallone felt that this level of violence would make audiences lose sympathy for the character and see him as a villain, rather than a victim of circumstances. The single death that occurs in First Blood happens during one of the movie's most memorable scenes, when Deputy Sergeant Art Galt pursues Rambo through the forest in a helicopter. Galt, who had been one of the most brutal officers during Rambo's arrest and torture at the police station, leans out of the helicopter with a high-powered rifle and tries to shoot the fleeing veteran. Rambo, seeking only to defend himself, picks up a rock and hurls it at the aircraft. The rock strikes Galt, but instead of causing a fatal injury, it simply throws him off balance at a critical moment. The deputy loses his grip and falls from the helicopter to his death, making this the only fatality in the entire film. Importantly, Rambo never intended to kill Galt. He was simply trying to stop the officer from shooting him, and the death was purely accidental. Throughout the rest of the movie, even when Rambo uses his military training and survival skills to fight back against the manhunt, he consistently chooses non-lethal methods to deal with his pursuers. He stabs deputies in non-vital areas, sets traps that injure but don't kill, and uses his combat expertise to neutralize threats without taking lives, creating a surprisingly bloodless action movie that focuses more on survival and psychological drama than pure violence. Fact 11. 26 failed scripts before Stallone. Before Sylvester Stallone ever set eyes on the First Blood project, the adaptation of David Morrell's novel had become one of Hollywood's most notorious examples of development hell, with an astounding 26 different screenwriters taking their turn at trying to crack the story and turn it into a workable movie script. This decade-long struggle to bring the book to the screen had left the project with a reputation as being cursed or impossible to adapt successfully. The problems began almost immediately after Columbia Pictures bought the film rights to Morrell's novel in 1972 for $175,000. Over the following years, the project bounced between different studios, writers, and directors, with each new team bringing their own vision of how the story should be told. Some versions focused more on the action elements, others tried to emphasize the psychological drama, and still others attempted to turn it into a straightforward thriller, but none of these approaches seemed to capture what made the original book compelling. The casting difficulties were just as challenging as the script problems, with virtually every major leading man in Hollywood being approached for the role of John Rambo at various points during the development process. Stars like Clint Eastwood, Steve McQueen, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Paul Newman, Jeff Bridges, Ryan O'Neal, Nick Nolte, Michael Douglas, and James Garner were all considered or offered the part, but for different reasons, none of them committed to the project. The director's chair proved equally difficult to fill, with at least 6 major filmmakers turning down the opportunity to helm the adaptation. Some directors felt the material was too violent, others thought it wasn't commercial enough, and many simply couldn't find a way to make the story work within the constraints of a typical Hollywood production. By the time the project reached director Ted Kotcheff, it had gained such a reputation as an unmakeable film that Stallone himself initially hesitated to get involved. The actor later admitted that he had serious doubts about taking on what many in the industry considered to be a cursed project that had already defeated so many talented writers and filmmakers before him. Fact 12. The car flip was a real accident. One of the most dramatic moments in First Blood's motorcycle chase sequence happened completely by accident, when a stunt went wrong in spectacular fashion, but the filmmakers were quick enough to recognize that this unplanned mishap had actually created something even better than what they had originally choreographed. During the high-speed pursuit where Rambo escapes on a stolen motorcycle with Sheriff Teasle and his deputies chasing after him in squad cars, the production captured a moment of genuine chaos that became one of the film's most memorable scenes. The accident occurred when the stuntman driving Sheriff Teasle's police car was supposed to navigate a particular section of the chase route that included some challenging terrain. However, something went wrong with either the timing, the speed, or the positioning of the vehicle, causing the squad car to flip over and roll in a way that was completely unscripted and unexpected. This wasn't a planned stunt or a controlled rollover that had been carefully choreographed by the stunt team, but rather a genuine accident that happened while the cameras were rolling. Director Ted Kotcheff later described this moment as one of those happy accidents that sometimes occur during filming, where reality creates something more interesting and dramatic than what the filmmakers had originally planned. Instead of stopping production to reset the scene, or calling for medical assistance if anyone had been injured, the crew recognized that they had captured something spectacular and immediately began thinking about how to incorporate this unplanned footage into the movie. Rather than discarding the accidental footage and reshooting the sequence as originally planned, Kotcheff and his team made the creative decision to build the rest of the scene around this dramatic car flip. They repositioned cameras and continued filming with Brian Dennehy actually getting into the overturned vehicle to shoot additional footage that would make the accident look like it was part of the intended sequence. Stallone later praised the crew's quick thinking and adaptability, noting that this willingness to embrace unexpected moments and work with what actually happened in front of the cameras, rather than being rigidly tied to the original script, helped create some of the most authentic and exciting action sequences in the film. Fact 13. All guardsmen used their real names. During the climactic scenes where the National Guard is called in to help capture Rambo in the abandoned mine shaft, the filmmakers made an unusual decision that blurred the line between the actors' real identities and their on-screen characters in a way that most viewers would never notice. Instead of creating entirely fictional character names for the soldiers pursuing Rambo underground, the production chose to have most of the guardsmen be called by the same names as the actors who were playing them. This decision was likely made for practical reasons during filming, since many of these roles were relatively small parts with limited dialogue, and it would have been easier for the cast and crew to keep track of who was who during the intense action sequences if they could simply use the actors' real names. When other characters needed to call out to these soldiers during the underground chase scenes, they could just use the performers' actual names rather than having to remember a completely separate set of fictional character names. The one significant exception to this naming pattern was the character of Lieutenant Clinton Morgan, who serves as the leader of the National Guard unit and has a more substantial role in the story. This character was given a proper fictional name, probably because he had more dialogue and screen time, making it worth the effort to create a distinct character identity separate from the actor portraying him, Patrick Stack. For all the other guardsmen who appear in these scenes, however, their character names match their real names exactly. This creates an interesting situation where these actors are essentially playing themselves, or at least playing characters who happen to share their names during some of the movie's most tense and dramatic moments. This behind-the-scenes detail adds an extra layer of authenticity to these scenes, since the soldiers are responding to their actual names rather than having to remember to respond to fictional character names during what were already complex and physically demanding action sequences. Most audiences watching First Blood would have no way of knowing that this naming convention was being used, making it one of those hidden production details that only becomes apparent when you look at the credits or behind-the-scenes information about how the film was made. Fact 14. Stallone considered self-injury to escape. Sylvester Stallone's initial enthusiasm for taking on the role of John Rambo was so low that he seriously considered injuring himself on purpose just to get out of his commitment to make the movie, revealing just how much doubt and anxiety he felt about the project before filming even began. The actor's reluctance stemmed from his awareness that First Blood had developed a notorious reputation in Hollywood as a cursed project that had already defeated numerous writers, directors, and actors over the course of nearly a decade. On the day Stallone was scheduled to travel to Canada to begin production, his nervousness about the project reached such a peak that he found himself contemplating desperate measures to avoid having to go through with filming. As he later recounted in interviews, he was visiting fellow actor Burt Reynolds' house when a particularly wild idea crossed his mind about how he might escape from his contractual obligations to the film. Stallone admitted that he actually considered deliberately slamming his own hand in a door at Reynolds' house with the intention of breaking bones or causing enough injury that he would have a legitimate medical excuse to postpone or cancel his involvement in the production. This wasn't just a passing thought or idle fantasy, but something he genuinely contemplated as a real option for getting out of what he feared would be a career-damaging disaster. The fact that Stallone was willing to consider inflicting physical harm on himself rather than make the movie shows just how pessimistic he was about First Blood's chances for success. At this point in his career, he had experienced several box office disappointments after the success of Rocky, and he was worried that another flop might seriously damage his standing in Hollywood. Stallone later joked that Burt Reynolds' house had probably seen many actors break their hands over the years, though he suggested that most of those injuries came from Reynolds himself, rather than from desperate actors trying to escape movie contracts. Fortunately for cinema history, Stallone ultimately decided against this drastic plan and traveled to Canada to begin filming, where he would eventually discover that his fears about the project were completely unfounded. Fact 15. Many extras were recently unemployed. When the First Blood production arrived in Hope, British Columbia in late 1981, they discovered that their timing coincided with a difficult period in the local economy that would actually work to the film's advantage in an unexpected way. A mill that had been one of the area's major employers had recently shut down operations, leaving many of the town's residents without work and struggling to make ends meet during what was already a challenging time for small communities across Canada. This economic hardship meant that when the film's casting directors put out a call for local extras to appear in crowd scenes and background shots throughout the movie, they were met with an enthusiastic response from people who were genuinely grateful for any opportunity to earn some income. The production needed dozens of townspeople to populate the streets of Hope during various scenes, particularly for the sequences showing Rambo's initial arrival in town, and the later scenes where the conflict escalates and draws more attention from the local community. For the recently unemployed mill workers and other local residents facing financial uncertainty, the chance to work as movie extras provided not just a source of much-needed income, but also an exciting break from the routine of unemployment and job searching. Many of these people had never been involved in a film production before, making the experience both financially beneficial and personally memorable during what was otherwise a difficult period in their lives. The casting call attracted so many applicants that the production had to be selective about who they chose, with 550 local residents showing up hoping to be picked for their chance at movie stardom. Out of this large group of hopeful participants, only about 100 were ultimately selected to appear in the various crowd scenes and background shots that required local townspeople. This situation created a mutually beneficial relationship between the Hollywood production and the local community, where the filmmakers got authentic-looking extras who genuinely belonged to the small-town setting they were trying to portray, while the residents got temporary employment and the excitement of being part of a major motion picture. The enthusiasm and gratitude of these local extras helped create a positive working relationship that made filming in Hope a pleasant experience for the cast and crew.